winter lecture, hosted by the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education. We're honoured to have Adam Hanieh with us this evening to deliver what will surely be an excellent and important talk. First, we would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And further, we acknowledge the right of First Nations people to real self-determination. We also believe that it's important to recognise the common struggles experienced by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous working people, as well as the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep us divided. We also want to acknowledge the ongoing genocide in Palestine by the Israeli state, which is ongoing despite the so-called ceasefire, and is still to this day supported by the Canadian government. We join calls for a two-way arms embargo and encourage attendees to heed calls for action from our comrades in Palestinian trade unions and civil society groups. So, before we get started, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Chris Little and I'm emceeing tonight, and I'm a member of both the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education and the Socialist Project. And with the school, I've been lucky enough to be involved as an instructor for some of our courses, more on that in just a second. And I'm also working on a PhD at York University, and I mention that because I first came across Adam's work in that academic context. Yeah, what struck me about his work, particularly for me an essay on migration in the Socialist Register, is the way that it mixes both analytical rigour with clear, accessible writing. So it's exciting and an honour to be here with you all tonight and introducing the lecture. Before I turn it over to Adam, I'd like to welcome Melanie Panitch to say a few words. Melanie has placed a great amount of trust in us as we play our part in carrying on Leo's legacy of keeping socialist ideas alive. Along with being an author and a strong advocate for disability rights, Melanie is an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and was a founding director of TMU School of Disability Studies. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Panitch.
I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to the organizing committee for bringing us together tonight. And let me say what an absolute pleasure it continues to be to work with Matt Davis, who along with his stalwart team has played a central role in orchestrating this event and extending an invitation to speak. First of all, I want to express my gratitude on behalf of Max and Vida for the work that is being enacted through this Leo School to keep their father's legacy alive. They are here tonight, and I'm delighted. By their presence here, and in many other ways, they too are keeping their father's legacy alive. I can see it in the decisions they are making about their own lives and the choices they are making as they build their own way forward. This fourth annual lecture provides a moment to consider just what has transpired since the school was launched in January 2023 with the first public lecture by Brian Palmer. The range and variety of events conducted under the auspices of the school is simply staggering. The courses, the public talks, the overwhelming request to host book launches, which sometimes seriously stretch their capacity to do so, is impressive. And let's not forget the film nights at the Eyesore Cinema on Bloor Street. The Eyesore Cinema, if ever a screening room, was aptly named. Through hosting a few social gatherings at my home, I've had a chance to get to know some of the people who have been committed themselves to making all of this happen. And happened not only in Toronto, but happened in New Brunswick and happened in Vancouver. I really do appreciate the opportunity to say a few words tonight, and what I want to say is mainly this. How much Leo would have loved to see all of you here. This crowd, this topic, this school, this growing community. I know how moved he would be to see his work carried on in this way by so many friends and comrades. And to the younger activists, you would have made him especially proud. He would have been especially proud to see you here tonight, Adam. continuing to thread a path with you from your PhD at York to the Friday afternoon Empire seminars, to socialist project events, and to the many pints you said you shared after those meetings. And as it happens, I've also been hearing about you beyond your fame and influence in this Toronto scene, because I understand you were recently lecturing in Cyprus at the university. I know this through my close Israeli friend Avishai Erlich, a friendship that goes back to the London School of Economics in the late 1960s. Avishai did not attend your lecture. He had left Cyprus a few days before to return to Tel Aviv, but he heard about your talk glowingly from his Cypriot friends. He told them if you ever returned, he would fly back instantly, wanting very much to meet you. I speak to Avishai about once a month. It's always an early Sunday morning call in which we get a very granular update of our lives, committing in that way to stay close across time and distance. On our most recent call, Adam, I told him you were coming here to give this lecture. Never shy of expressing an opinion, he pronounced unreservedly you were, quote, the perfect choice. Thinking ahead to my assignment here this evening, I pushed him to tell me a little more. He replied that, well, he knew you'd been at York, and that having followed your work for years, he assumed, as he put it, there was a Leo connection. Then he paused, and he thought for a moment and deepened his response, adding, quote, I also think that Adam's clear and cool explanation, his deeply political but not propagandistic style, has a Leo spirit in it. In the email exchange you and I had this past week, you expressed your relationship with Leo as that of a constant intellectual companionship over the past 20 years. That you were indeed the perfect choice hits the mark. I think there could be no finer honor in both your work and his than to have you speak here tonight. There will be others, Adam, who will speak to the critical importance and the timeliness of the subject we're going to address this evening, and the room is at full capacity so you can gauge the interest and how highly you are regarded. But I hope to my brief comments this evening to both welcome you warmly and to bring Leo into the room tonight, where I know he would so love to be with all of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Melanie, for those words. So I'd like to introduce our featured lecturer this evening. Adam Hanieh is a professor in development studies at SOAS, University of London, and director of the SOAS Middle East Institute. He specializes in the political economy of energy, oil, and capitalism in the Middle East, and is the author of Crude Capitalism, which serves as the inspiration for tonight's lecture. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Adam Hanieh to the stage.
Thank you very much to everyone for coming tonight, Matt and Chris and all the comrades at SP for organising and bringing together the event, and of course Melanie for her very touching words. I wanted to say, I know many people here obviously have worked and been taught by and been active with Leo over the years, and I think one of the things I said to Melanie in our email exchange is that the Empire seminar, the discussions that we've had over the years, one of the things that really come out about Leo is his non-sectarian, open attitude. Even with people he disagreed with, theoretically, politically, he'd always be open to bringing those people into spaces and having the debate out with them. And I think that's the kind of spirit that really has stuck with me over the years, and I think it's exemplified in all of the events that Leo put together. The other thing I said to Melanie is that he always had a very careful way of trying to build in the university settings and outside of the university settings a Marxist space, if you like, bringing younger people with him, and trying to build new generations of Marxists and activists. And I think I often say to friends in London that this is the kind of thing we need to do much more. Not just think about it in the current moment, but also the kind of intergenerational passing of knowledge and building those institutional spaces. So I think that's the kind of spirit that is clearly, I think, embodied in the school, and it's a great honour to be speaking and delivering this lecture tonight. So I want to speak tonight about this topic of oil, capitalism, and in particular what I've called the East-East energy axis, which I'll explain in some depth in a second. But I wanted to begin first by just talking a little bit about the kind of theoretical framing of the book and how I try to approach this question of oil and thinking about oil, because there's a lot that's been written about oil, as I'm sure many people in this room know, from the kind of long histories of the oil industry to the questions of the climate today. And the impetus for this book actually stemmed from a dissatisfaction in the way that people think about oil and the way that oil is often discussed. And that dissatisfaction is essentially what I've described here as a kind of a commodity fetishism, borrowing from Marx here, in the sense that oil, which at the end of the day is just a sticky black goo, somehow has this immense power over our lives. It is described as a curse in some of the literature. It is described as a prize in some of the literature. It is seen as having this immense power, but the power is at the end of the day embodied in this simple black goo. And we need to ask, as Marx would have said, what is it about the society that we live in that has given oil this apparent power over our lives? That's the question we need to ask if we're going to also move beyond fossil fuels and oil more generally. So thinking about capitalism, capitalist social relations, and what is it about capitalism that has really propelled oil from about the middle of the 20th century to this central part of our existence, such that it is now destroying the planet in very graphic ways. So I'm going to speak to some of this as we go through tonight, but there are what I would call various logics of capitalism, the pressure to continually produce more and more in this kind of endless accumulation. There is, very importantly, the speeding up of production and consumption, what Marx called the turnover time of capital, in the sense that when we think about our daily lives, the production of commodities, the consumption of commodities is always accelerating because that's how you get more consumed and therefore more profit. There is the kind of tendency towards mechanization, and these kinds of logics that what I argue in the book are what we need to center in trying to understand what it is about oil that has made it such a powerful life, such that we ascribe to it this power inherent to it. So the other couple of things in the book that I want to just note is, one is to try to tell the history of capitalism in particular over the last 100 years. And as I said, oil emerged in the middle of the 20th century as the dominant fossil fuel. But relate this to the question of US power and American dominance, something, of course, that was very dear to the kind of analytical framework of Leo and Sam in terms of thinking about the making of global capitalism and the place of American power within that. And as I will speak to tonight, and this maybe Leo wouldn't agree with this, the relative decline of the American state and American power. The final thing that the book tries to do is to move beyond a tendency in a lot of the discussion about oil to think about it simply from what oil, simply of underground reserves, if you like, the crude state of oil, to actually consider what does oil become as it circulates in our lives. And I'm going to speak in some detail to this around the questions of petrochemicals and plastics, but also questions of finance, the US dollar, the kind of financial architecture that we live in today. So, in other words, oil is pervasive, not simply in its crude state, but through what it becomes as it's refined and as it circulates in our lives. Again, I'll come to that in a second. So that's just some of the kind of brief overview. This is the kind of some of the themes in the book. There is a kind of a geographical spread. There's sections on the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as post-Soviet Russia, and so forth. But obviously I'm not going to speak to all of these things tonight. Instead, what I want to do tonight is look at four themes, four topics. The first of these will be the question of petrochemicals and plastics. Secondly, I'm going to look at the rise of state-controlled national oil companies, or the NOCs, and what I've called this East-East hydrocarbon axis. Thirdly, questions of finance, imperialism, American imperialism and oil. And then finally, what does this maybe mean for eco-socialist movements, such as many of us are involved in this room. So let me begin firstly with this question of petrochemicals and plastics, which to me is really a blind spot in how we think about fossil fuels and how we think about the question of oil. If we look around us in this room, essentially everything that surrounds us, from our clothes, from the carpets, from our bags, the paints on the wall, the rubber, synthetic rubbers, these are all products of oil. We are sitting in a sea of oil products. And very often we think about oil simply as what we put in our cars, the liquid fuel, forgetting that actually it is now the basis of basically all material production. Synthetic products derived from oil, such as rubbers, such as plastics, such as fertilizers, and so forth. These synthetic products emerged around the middle of the 20th century, became really ubiquitous around the middle of the 20th century, which I'll explain in a second. And it has, I think, centering this question of petrochemicals and plastics and this kind of synthetic world that we live in, tells us a lot about the problems we face with fossil fuels and what it means to move beyond them. So, just a quick history. Again, I don't want to speak into all of this, but the chemical industry in the early 20th century was dominated, essentially vastly dominated by Germany, and was closely associated with the rise of Nazi Germany. Many of the big cartels and corporations that backed Hitler's rise, such as IG Farben, were chemical companies involved in slave labor in Auschwitz and other places, and linked closely to the making of the Nazi war machine. Through the Second World War, however, there was a shift. The German industry was based upon coal as the kind of material substrate through which chemicals were produced. Through the Second World War, there was a process through which the big American oil companies, in close alliance with the American state and with the infrastructure supported through the American state, shifted that material substrate towards oil rather than coal. Okay? And in doing so, through the war itself, broke broke up the chemical industry, and it's a fascinating story which I don't have time to go into, but basically stole the secrets and recuperated many of the Nazi chemists and war criminals in this process in shifting the basis of chemical production away from coal towards oil. This happened, as I said, around the middle of the 20th century and accelerated rapidly after the Second World War with the invention of thermoplastics, kind of heat-molded plastics that could be molded by heat, as well as various kinds of machinery. Now, what did this do for capitalism? This is coming to this point of why do we need to foreground capitalism in this project or in this process. What it did was it decoupled material production from limits of nature, because previously most of the commodities that we consumed were derived from natural products like natural rubber, glass, wood, and so forth. By making essentially a waste product of the oil industry into the raw material through which plastics and other petrochemicals were produced, it enabled a massive acceleration in the scale of commodity production. And one of the graphic examples of this is the question of clothing. If we think today, as I said, most of the things we are wearing are synthetic oil-derived products, kinds of plastics. And if you look at a graph of clothing production, you will see a fairly steady rise and then a vast, quick acceleration as these synthetic fibers enter the picture of manufacturing of clothing. So the notion of fast fashion, the idea that, as you can see, I'm an expert in fashion, the notion of fast fashion, the idea that clothing styles change multiple times in a season, instead of just being associated with one or two styles. The huge increase in clothing varieties and styles, and of course waste, was associated with this introduction of synthetic fibers into the industry, alongside, of course, the conditions of labor in places like Bangladesh and elsewhere. The point being that decoupling production, and this is not simply around the question of fashion, it's also connected to food, it's connected with building materials, and all sorts of other commodities, enabled, basically ended the limits to quantities of production and enabled this huge increase in the variety of goods. Of course, we are living with the consequences of that today with waste, and I'll come back to this question of waste and petrochemicals in a second. This process, described on this cover of Fortune magazine in 1960 as the chemical century, was very much linked to the emergence of the oil industry, in particular the American oil industry. It was the American oil firms, what today we know as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and these big American firms that pioneered this shift to oil, but also dominated the production of these downstream chemical products, petrochemicals. So it is at this moment that we see the oil industry interested not simply in the extraction of underground reserves, but also the controlling of the refinery process and turning those refined goods into what's called downstream products like plastics and petrochemicals. These companies, the oil industry, was among the very first to have this deep vertical integration, where they were involved at each stage from the raw material through to the sale of the consumer. And this is important when we think about the oil industry today. Of course, we can never separate this out from the conditions in which the sites were located, the labor that went into refining and petrochemicals, and in the United States in particular, it was associated with areas, racialized communities, along what was called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. These areas were former slave plantations that were turned into the chemical industry, the center of the chemical industry, with all of the attendant consequences. And I recently that Canada has a similar history in terms of the refining and petrochemical industry in Canada. So, what are the implications of this question? Firstly, the rise of these synthetic products were associated, as I said, with this major transformation in how material production takes place. Through the multiplication of products, the scale and volume associated with commodity production. It was very, very important, though, to think about how this really cemented the place of oil in our lives. Previously, coal had been the leading fossil fuel. Around the middle of the 20th century, oil emerged in that place and remains so today. But it wasn't simply because oil was a liquid fuel, petrol and these kinds of fuels. It was because oil became this the basic material of all commodity production. At the same time, and this is, I think, a really important point, oil became invisible in our lives. We don't think about the fact that we are essentially sitting in the sea of oil. It's become, if you like, second nature to only think about oil in the form of its liquid fuel rather than in this place of material production. And when we think about this in terms of the struggle against fossil fuels, we know, for example, at least in the UK, anytime you open up the Guardian newspaper or any newspaper, there are stories about microplastics, nanoplastics, the toxic effects on various parts of the body, of course, plastic waste and the spread of plastic waste throughout the whole of the biosphere. But the way that is typically framed is this is a question of needing to do more recycling or to deal with the problems of waste itself, rather than thinking about this as a problem of fossil fuels. Okay? Plastics and petrochemicals is closely associated with this place of oil in our lives, even though it is invisible. And we cannot deal with the question of waste and toxicity without tackling the question of fossil fuels, oil in particular. So it's interesting to note that in the various negotiations going on around plastics treaties, the line of the oil companies like ExxonMobil is that the problem is waste, not production. This is the line that's continually made by the oil companies, who explicitly talk about plastics as the future of oil. In those terms, they realize that the demand for oil will continue because of this role in plastics and petrochemicals. I'll come back to this, a few more questions of this in a second. So let me turn now to the second point I want to deal with tonight, which is the rise of these national oil companies and the kind of changing geographies of the oil industry. What we see, you can see on this table here, is a very dramatic change in global oil imports and the global oil trade happening over the last 20 years. In the early 2000s, the center of the world oil trade was United States and Europe. This table shows the share of world crude oil imports into various regions of the world. Now, you can see that over the last 20 years, there's been a massive increase. There has been a major geographic shift in oil imports away from the US and Europe towards China and wider East Asia. China now consumes about 25% of the world's oil imports. Now this shift, this eastward shift in the world's oil trade is deeply, obviously, connected to the rise of China within the world system, China's central place in global manufacturing and industrialization. China has itself about 6th or 7th world, crude oil reserves, yet it still depends fully, given the scale of its needs, on imports to satisfy its industry. So we can see this massive shift. Now, this shift wasn't simply a positive sum game in the sense that oil shifted from one part of the world to another. It was associated with an overall increase of about 30% in global oil consumption, okay, since around the early 2000s. So a huge increase in the total volume of oil that is being consumed, and this shift eastward to China as the main center of world oil demand. Now, the key point here is that China's share of world oil imports now sits at 25%, but the vast majority of this comes from the Middle East region. So in particular, the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, as well as Iraq and Iran. So oil has shifted, the exports of those states have shifted away from the west towards the east. And associated with this, we now see the rise of national oil companies such as Saudi Aramco, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, please don't get me wrong here. I'm not at all trying to say that the big Western oil companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, Eni, and so forth are no longer important, or they're being sidelined, or they're being marginalized. This is not the case at all. However, we see this kind of fragmentation of the world oil market around, if you like, a North American, West European bloc on one side, and this kind of East-East link between the Gulf, China, and East Asia on the other. Okay? The question, and I'll speak a little bit to the dynamics between these two parts of the industry in a second. So, very importantly, this company needs, as eco-socialists, I think, much more attention. Saudi Aramco is today, by far, the largest oil company in the world. Its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the 5 largest Western firms, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, and Total Energies. The combined profits of those 5 Western firms were exceeded by those of Saudi Aramco. What is very important about Aramco is that it's state-run in the sense that it's controlled by the Saudi monarchy, the Saudi state. However, the other very important factor is that it has also undergone this kind of vertical integration that I spoke about in terms of the Western oil companies earlier in the 20th century. So today, Aramco is present all down the value chain. It's not simply an exporter of crude oil, it's a major refiner, and it's a major petrochemical producer, and it is also a major marketer of oil. In China, for instance, you will see Aramco branded service stations, petrol stations. The second largest producer of synthetic rubber in the world is now owned by Saudi Aramco. So it's present in fertilizers and all at the cutting edge of research and so forth. So this process of vertical integration that I described in the case of the Western oil companies is now a feature of these national oil companies as well. Aramco is the really important one, but there's also the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, which ran the COP28 summit in Dubai a couple of years ago, which I'll come to in a second. And Qatar Energy is another important actor in Qatar. Again, these are oil and gas firms. They're involved in the upstream crude sector, but also all the way down down the value chain. They are closely connected in the Gulf states and the Gulf monarchies, like Saudi Arabia, with capitalism and the capitalist classes in these states, which I can speak to in more detail later if you're interested. But very importantly, they are increasingly taking a lead role in steering the direction of global climate policy. So, I mentioned COP28. That was chaired and run by the chief executive of ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So we have a clear, I mean, he didn't see it this way, but clear conflict of interest, the head of the oil company running the major climate summit. We look at somewhere like Saudi Aramco, or a company like Saudi Aramco, it was the lead force in blocking the treaty or negotiations around the global plastics treaty. Okay? Now, why is this significant? Because Saudi Aramco, being a state-owned company, has someone at the table, i.e. the Saudi government, when these negotiations are taking place. Okay? And similarly with these other national oil companies. So they have exactly the same line, if you like, on the climate emergency as ExxonMobil. And I'm not saying, of course, ExxonMobil is a major lobbyist and obviously deeply implicated with the Trump administration. But in terms of actually involvement in the making of policy, these firms are now playing a very prominent role. It was Saudi Aramco that really, and the Saudi state, that really blocked this plastics treaty, which was aimed at limiting the production of plastics. Okay? Instead, the debate shifted, as I said, towards how do we recycle better, rather than actually any limits on plastics production. There are other examples that I can give here that I think are illustrative, but again, for reasons of time, I won't do so. Just on this question of plastics, again, to show the kind of downstream vertical integration of these firms, this is the global, these two basic polymers, ethylene and propylene, the two basic chemicals that are the if you like, the inputs to all of the plastics and so forth that I've been speaking about. This shows the various, these are the top 5 importers of these polymers globally. You can see China is by far leading this import trade, similarly as they did with crude oil in that last table I showed. And you can see that there is a significant, in fact, the largest share of their imports coming from the Gulf monarchies, okay? Saudi Arabia, UAE, United Arab Emirates in particular. So we can see it's not just crude oil that's shifted eastward, it's also these refined plastics and petrochemicals that have also shifted eastward, okay? Obviously very much associated with China's place in global manufacturing. The fact that much of what we consume here has these chemicals at their base and produced in China. So this is, I think, an important thing to think about, because these east-east links are not simply exports of crude oil. They involve joint investments, joint projects all down the value chain. And they also involve foreign investments between these different geographies. So here you can see listed on this table, in China, these 5 petrochemical firms. These are the largest 5 petrochemical firms in China. About 30% of China's petrochemical industry is privately owned. And all of them are part owned by Gulf-based firms. Okay? So we see the Gulf, Saudi Aramco in particular, embedded inside production networks inside China. Okay? It's not just the import of crude oil, they're involved in the production of these plastics and petrochemicals. South Korea, this is not simply a China-focused example. South Korea, S-Oil, for example, which is building the largest refinery in the world, I believe, is actually fully owned by Saudi Aramco. Okay? And there are other examples you can see here of this kind of joint ownership structures that have now bridged these geographies in very clear ways. Finally, this table, this shows the largest petrochemical plants that are currently being built in the world. And you can see Shaheen in South Korea. It's a fully owned subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. It's going to be the world's largest refinery integrated petrochemical plant. So we can see the, if you like, the geography of this industry. This is not to say that this is not connected, of course, to what we consume in Europe, the United States, North America, but we need to think about the different geographies that are emerging in this industry if we're seriously going to tackle the question of fossil fuels today. So all of the ones marked in yellow here have this kind of joint Gulf-China connections. Just very quickly, these connections between the Gulf and China are not simply about oil and hydrocarbons and petrochemicals. They are evident in other sectors as well. To me, the most striking factor here is this, the first bullet point here. 60% of all China's trade with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa actually takes place through UAE ports. Okay? So we can see the way that the Gulf region is acting as this kind of mediating link between China's trade with the rest of the world in this way. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of how we think about finance, imperialism, and oil? And here is, I think, this part Leo would be very happy to hear, because it's kind of, I think, in some ways supports the arguments that Sam and Leo made maybe 20 years ago now. So obviously the sale of oil, in the sense of this increase in exports, all of this kind of trade, has been associated with a huge inflow of petrodollar, what's called petrodollar surpluses, financial surpluses made through the sale of oil and other hydrocarbons, accumulating in the Gulf states. Okay? The Gulf states are now one of the key surplus zones globally, alongside China and Japan. Okay? And this, I think, this is taken from a recent IMF report. It might be a bit difficult to see, but the kind of lighter shade green are the oil exporters in particular. The Gulf monarchies are the standout in this sense. You can see that they are one of those key surplus zones in terms of current account balances. So where does this money go? You know, they sell oil, they're involved in this industry, they receive US dollars in return for the sale of this oil. Some of that is accumulated in foreign reserves, some of it goes into sovereign wealth funds, some of it goes into large corporations. But where does it go globally? That's the key question that we need to ask if we're going to understand the oil industry beyond simply the question of trade. Firstly, the scale of these assets, these petrodollar surpluses or financial surpluses, are huge. Gulf foreign reserves stand at around 800 billion, okay, which are fourth in the world behind China, Japan, and Switzerland. In terms of sovereign wealth funds, these are funds that are controlled by Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies. For instance, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authorities is an important one. They control about 4.9 trillion in assets. About 40% of global sovereign wealth funds now are held by Gulf sovereign wealth funds. 6 of the 10 largest funds are Gulf owned. So this is again a huge amount of money. We have private wealth also clearly present in the Gulf, estimated at around 2.8 trillion and increasing from there. Associated with this kind of Chinese rise, if you like, is this influx of financial surpluses accumulating in these various vehicles owned by the state or in private conglomerates or privately held wealth. Where does this money actually circulate globally then? Some of it goes into urban and local industry in the Gulf states. You know, I'm sure those of you who visited the region or seen pictures, you'll know the kind of fanciful buildings and skyscrapers and various projects that are announced. Much of them maybe don't come through or not at the scale they're imagined, but basically that industrial urban transformation of the urban environment is partly associated with these surpluses. Some of them this money flows into neighboring states like Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, other states, increasingly in the African continent, to purchase land, to purchase telecommunications, industrial firms. Ports is a big investment target here. So we see, alongside the liberalization of these kinds of sectors, this cross-border investment, where Gulf-based firms and state-owned firms are becoming major players in many of these sectors in the region. However, the key point, and this is the point that Leo would be smiling at, I think, is that the most important sector for these investments continues to be US financial markets. Okay? In the sense that despite the fact that there has been this eastward shift, the financial surpluses associated with this continue to flow predominantly into US financial markets, into dollar assets. And it's very interesting to look at this in comparison with other surplus zones like China and Japan. If you look at, for example, US equity investments, foreign investments in US equities, the Gulf now stands at around 5% of all foreign investment, which is basically apart if you exclude London and the Cayman Islands and these kinds of offshore zones where the actual ownership of who's investing from is difficult to ascertain, the Gulf stands up within the top three, okay, in terms of equity ownership. There is also investments in treasury bonds and other US firms. We've seen this in recent months with Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE and to Qatar, where there are these deals made about investments into AI and various other things. So the point being that in contrast to what is sometimes described in kind of a multipolar world, we do see the rise of China in this context actually deepening the importance of the Gulf to US power globally, okay, and into US financial markets. Okay, so it's much more complicated than the typical narrative of multipolarity or China's rise and the US decline, etc. That's often present, including on the left. Okay. The other very important part of this, of course, is arms sales, military sales, and here this is again something that is often not spoken about, but the Gulf is the largest import market in the world for military hardware, consumption of military hardware. Most of this comes from the United States. I think, Saudi Arabia, the largest single recipient of US arms in 2020 to 2024. Now, obviously, Israel is a major recipient of US arms, and it's not just the US who's producing these arms, but in terms of consumption of military hardware, the Gulf is absolutely central to understanding. And this is important for these kind of petrodollar flows, because this is another way that money that accumulates in the Gulf flows back into US firms, okay? Lockheed Martin and all these kinds of producers. So there are multiple ways in which the kind of petrodollars and financial surpluses associated with the region end up back in the United States. Now, this is actually, those of you who have been following the kind of Netflix takeover stuff will know the Gulf is actually involved. This is, I haven't followed the very recent details, but this is from a month or so ago, where there was an agreement with Kushner being, I think, the paramount bid for Netflix, which I think is now going ahead, is actually involved, is a partnership with Gulf-owned sovereign wealth funds, okay, in terms of the money that's taking over Netflix. Sorry, not Netflix, Warner Brothers. So these kind of patterns are important to think about in terms of these global questions. Now, what does this all mean for how we think about then imperialism, what's going on in the Middle East, the genocide in Palestine, bigger global conflicts, American relative decline, which I still think is a convincing account of what we're seeing, not absolute but relative decline, the rise of other powers such as China. And what I would say here is that the Middle East, because of all of the patterns that I've described, both in terms of its exports of oil, China's dependence upon those crude oil and other connections, as well as the investments into American financial markets, remains a region that is absolutely central to the future of American power globally. And the way that is being expressed is through the historic alliances between the United States and its two major pillars or allies in the Middle East. On one hand, Israel, and on the other hand, the Gulf monarchies, in particular Saudi Arabia. Okay? What the US is trying to do, and has been trying to do for the last 30 years, is to bring those two pillars, Israel on one side and the Gulf states on the other, normalize the relations between them, bring them together under the auspices of American power as a counterweight and as a functional tool, if you like, in any deeper conflict with China, if it ever came to that. Okay? In the sense of China's dependence upon oil, but also these financial flows. So this attempt to reassert US primacy in the region through this normalization of economic, political, diplomatic ties is, I think, absolutely key. Melanie mentioned Cyprus, and this is a fact that I picked up actually in the visit to Cyprus, is something called the 3+1 agreements, which is the 3 stands for Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, and the +1 stands for the US. And these are agreements that are being established rapidly in Greece and Cyprus to link Israel's, and particularly export of gas, into Europe through these kinds of framework agreements. So this is another indication of how this, these alliances are being built. So I think I don't have time to speak to this now, but I think this also helps us understand other parts of the world, such as what happened in Venezuela a few months ago. In the sense that these questions of oil and the kind of global rivalries that we see are really being played out in the Middle East in this kind of way. We cannot understand what is happening in Palestine simply through the lens of Palestine or Israel itself. We need to understand the place of Palestine and Israel and the Israeli state in the bigger architecture of power of the Middle East and the place of the Middle East in the emergence of global oil economy over the last century. So let me just wrap up with a couple of final remarks on the questions of eco-socialism. What does this mean? The first thing is that we can see, and here I want to be very blunt, I think this question of a green transition is a myth. There is no green transition taking place. Instead, what we see very clearly in the Gulf and elsewhere, particularly with the Trump administration, is this acceleration of oil and increasingly gas as part of this in a very big way, production. So a couple of years ago, the Saudi oil minister said every drop of hydrocarbon will come out. And this is not just a rhetorical statement. It's backed by state plans to accelerate the production of oil and gas. These plans are backed by money and investment. They're not speculative. They're not simply for the purpose of boosting stock prices. They're actually deeply committed to this. In particular, LNG, okay, in the Gulf, as well as oil. As I said, this is not simply a feature of the Gulf national oil companies. The Western firms are lamenting the fact that they don't have enough crude reserves and are expanding their production. ExxonMobil, for example, is targeted Guyana, next door to Venezuela, as its major crude reserve base. And we can see other places in the African continent being targeted by the Western firms in these kinds of ways. So, accelerated gas and oil and gas production. However, and this is the key point, we also see the expansion of renewables. We see the expansion of solar and wind in China in a very big way, and in the Gulf states, which might sound surprising, but actually the fastest growing region in the Middle East for solar and wind is the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. By about half of the region's renewable capacity is now located in the Gulf states. Okay? The fastest growing region in the world outside of China is the Middle East for renewable capacity. Okay? Now, this might sound a bit weird. How is it that on one hand the Gulf states are ramping up oil and gas production, but on the other hand they're also wanting to increase solar, wind, and battery technology and other kinds of things? The answer was very neatly provided by the Saudi oil minister. Again, a few years ago, when asked this question by a journalist, he said, we see this as a triple win, the expansion of renewables. Number one, we get to say to the world we're meeting our climate targets. We're at the forefront, and it's true. The climate targets for Saudi Arabia are actually faster than many EU states in terms of renewables and other things. That's the first win. The second win is that electricity in the Gulf states is generally provided by the burning of oil and gas. Okay? That's how electricity is made in these states, and it's expensive. And the demand for oil and gas and electricity is set to increase, partly because of climate change and the need for air conditioning, and partly because of the industrial expansion that I showed in those earlier slides around petrochemicals and other industries. So they want to cheapen the cost of electricity through the introduction of renewables to take some of the pressure off burning of fossil fuels. So that's the second win. The third win, and this is the most important, and is said explicitly, is we want to free up oil and gas for export. We make more money through exporting oil and gas than we do by burning it at home. So it's actually about increasing the volume of oil and gas production. So there is no contradiction here between the expansion of renewables and the expansion of the oil and gas industry. In fact, one actually facilitates the other. This is the key point. So this graph, which is provided by a colleague of mine, I think kind of graphically illustrates this additive nature of global energy production. You can see the rise of oil that I noted in the beginning around the middle of the 20th century. In the orange kind of shade, really dramatically expands after the Second World War. However, if you look at coal also continues to expand. In fact, coal, oil and gas reached record levels of production and consumption in that last year. Okay? So, in other words, this idea of an energy transition under capitalism is additive, it's not a replacement. Okay? It's not like coal to oil transition meant the end of coal. It was layered on top of coal and allowed the expansion of the total energy supply. So I think this is an important thing to realize when we're talking about these questions of renewables. There's a systemic feature of capitalism that I noted at the beginning around this kind of continued ramping up of energy consumption. And in fact, if you look historically at drop in oil consumption, it's basically at moments of deep economic crisis. Basically 4 times in the last 70 years that we've seen a significant drop. The early 1980s recession, COVID, the 2008 recession. These are the moments where we see temporary drops in consumption. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just end with saying that the point that I'm trying to make, and I think this is also a point that Leo would approve of, is that the problem is capitalism. It's not simply a question of oil companies. It's not simply a question of dealing with the byproducts of the oil industry, whether they be microplastics or waste. There's systemic problems. We need to start with what is it about oil what is it about capitalism that has valorized oil and made it so powerful in our lives? And if we're going to deal with the environmental consequences of that, which is something that we must do at this moment, that means moving beyond capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that. That was really fascinating. I'm sure it's generated some questions, so we have time for some questions.
Thank you for those questions. So, firstly, on the question of Yemen and the Middle East more generally, the thing, I guess the takeaway, one of the takeaway messages that I didn't mention, and I should have mentioned, and it's mentioned in the book and in a book on Palestine as well, is that this kind of framing of the region, or the framing of Palestine and the conflicts in the region, as a consequence of thinking about how the Middle East's place in global capitalism emerged. In particular, oil is obviously a big part of that, but it's not simply oil as a physical substance. It's also these financial surpluses that we see recirculating that I've described. If we think about the region in that way, and the conflicts in the region, like in Palestine, like in Yemen, like in Sudan, Libya, and elsewhere, then we can think about the importance of the region to the climate movement itself, to eco-socialism. When we talk about the genocide in Palestine, for instance, this is not simply something we should oppose because of its barbarity. It is something that's deeply embedded with the struggle against fossil fuels, because there's no way to break with an oil-centered global economy without shifting the regional order in the Middle East. Climate activists need to take the Middle East seriously, the politics of the Middle East, including in Palestine, including in Yemen and elsewhere, as part of the climate struggle. Okay? So, and vice versa, activists around Palestine need to be climate activists as well. These kinds of issues are not separate. Okay? So the question of Yemen, and also I'll come to Africa in a second, it's very clear the same actors that are involved and that I've described here, in particular, of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Gulf, as well as Israel and the American state, are the main protagonists in these various conflicts that we see in the region. Yemen is very clear. That was directly bombed, of course, by the Gulf states. Now, what is interesting in the case of Yemen is that these Saudi Arabia and the UAE have taken up different sides, and there are rivalries between them over these states. In Yemen and also in Sudan, they've backed different factions, if you like, different armed forces. So there is a rivalry between these states over their kind of positioning in the region. But we can't separate that from this bigger picture of a reassertion of American primacy and the attempts to kind of normalize relations, in particular between Israel and the Gulf. The second question on African continent is also very important, and there's a few things I'd say here. One of the things I think is, if you're talking about the oil industry, it's very interesting to look at how the African continent, in particular places like Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, other oil-producing states, emerged in the 80s and 1990s as a key source of crude oil for the big Western firms when oil was nationalized in the Gulf. Okay? So ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, there's a certain point in the 80s and early 90s where the base of their crude reserves is actually from various African countries. Okay? So in a way, they were able to ameliorate the problem of oil nationalization through turning more deeply into the African continent. And that remains true in many ways today, if you look at the ownership of the industry. However, it's also true, as you noted, that the other thing that's happened in the last 10 years or so is this internationalization of Gulf-based capital into various African states. Taking over land, agriculture is a big part of it. Certainly the gold question in some states is important. Ports are very important to all of this, and other kinds of industries. Again, I think this is part of kind of this jostling for power, if you like, regional projection of power. The final thing I'll say about that is it's interesting when we're thinking about the kind of financial dimensions of this, in particular the place of the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and some of the kind of free zones, financial free zones, which allow money that emerges from conflict, whether it be about gold or other kinds of minerals, to be, if you like, laundered through these financial zones in Dubai and Abu Dhabi in particular, and from there make their way to London and New York and other places. So there's a link, again, to this financial story of how these states have become, if you like, stopping points on the bigger flow of resources and illicit funds from the African continent into Western markets. There's many contradictions, obviously, in the ability of the United States to push this kind of normalization between the Gulf states. And just to give a plotted history at the kind of official level, a key turning point was the Oslo Accords of the early 1990s, which saw key Arab states, in particular Jordan and Egypt, normalize very deeply with Israel. And that was, in essence, the kind of regional purpose of the Oslo Accords, was to facilitate that regional integration. At that moment, while some of Qatar, for example, opened a representative office for Israel at that moment, which is often forgotten today, but there wasn't kind of official ties beyond those kinds of limited spaces. The big turning point, of course, was the 2020 Abraham Accords, which saw Israel normalize with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and this moment under the first Trump administration was a big step forward for this kind of American project, because there is no way that the UAE and Bahrain would have normalized with Israel without Saudi Arabia giving its blessing. It just wouldn't have happened. So the Saudi willingness to see this project along is, I don't think, in question. Now, this was followed in 2022 by a free trade agreement between the UAE and Israel that has continued throughout the genocide, with exports from the UAE and vice versa into Israel. So you can see kind of where the chips lie at that level. However, as you know, there's many kind of obstacles to this. One is, of course, the Palestinian people, and indeed, this is, I think, what this moment, the last 2 years, has actually really been about, is to break that resistance to the normalization project, and to find a group of Palestinian leadership that is willing to give the green light. And that's, I think, part of what this Board of Peace is actually about. Because in the Board of Peace, we see Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, as well as Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and a variety of other states, actually working together about the reconstruction, so-called reconstruction. So there's that push. But so the Palestinian people is one, but also we shouldn't underestimate the kind of deep opposition in the wider region to this project throughout the region. So it's, you know, we shouldn't forget in 2011 there were you know, revolts across every Arab state, as well as states in Africa and elsewhere that were against the kind of economic polarization, the deep scars of neoliberalism in the region, but also the political tail ending or the political orientation of leaders like Mubarak in Egypt towards normalization with Israel. The protests in Egypt, their roots were by activists who were involved in Palestine solidarity a decade earlier, in many cases. So, you know, we can't separate the kind of regional dynamics from those points. Yeah, the question on China and the Gulf. So there are these deep ties beyond simply the hydrocarbon sector, and these kind of interdependencies that are forming economically. We see also in sectors like AI, the renewable energy sector I mentioned in the Gulf, it's basically joint Chinese and Gulf firms, oil firms actually, involved in building out a lot of this infrastructure. However, we can't forget that ultimately the Gulf states, they are monarchies, tiny layers of Gulf societies who depend upon that alliance with the United States, ultimately depend upon it, the military, political and economic guarantee that the US provides the Gulf states, that China doesn't. So this is why Saudi Arabia or the UAE is different from Iraq or Iran or elsewhere, where you'd have kind of a long history of left movements, popular movements, able to challenge the regimes. But in the question of the Gulf monarchies, that alliance with the United States has basically meant that the Gulf monarchies are not willing to step beyond certain limits in their connections with China. So, you know, you hear this speculation that there's going to be oil trade in renminbi. That's not going to happen. I mean, it might be like spoken about, but it's not going to happen as long as this American alliance is here. And similarly, we can see in places like AI or some of the data centers or telecommunication sectors, the Americans have put pressure for the UAE and Saudi Arabia to back out of agreements with Chinese firms. So still very much that alliance with the United States is the pillar of these regimes. So yeah, firstly on this question of how does the US administration see the Gulf monarchies as that. I mean, you're very right in terms of kind of the popular ways that the monarchies are thought about. That's certainly the kind of discourse around that. And it's not just in the US, by the way, it's also true in the Middle East, that many Arabs and others think about the Gulf monarchies as being you know, backward and etc. And I hope one thing you get from what I've said tonight is that we need to get rid of this kind of very Orientalist way of thinking about these regimes. They are capitalist countries, they have capitalist classes, they have labor working classes. The working classes are actually mostly a migrant. Okay, 50% of the labor force in all of these states are non-citizens. There's no other place in the world where we have this kind of class structure. And this is one reason why they are so functional to American power, by the way. So the class structure can't be separated from this bigger question of US and imperialist interests in the region. So yeah, we need to kind of get rid of this viewpoint. And you know, I think it's not just Trump, it's the other kind of you know, people in the American administration are very clear about the importance of these states to the bigger American project. It's not an accident. The first place Trump visited, both in his first election in 2016 as well as this recent election, was Saudi Arabia. First place in the world. Then he went to Qatar, UAE, and Israel, I think. I'm not sure if that's the exact order, but it tells you something about where the priorities sit. And it's not about like get me money to buy a plane or whatever. I mean, I'm sure those things go on, but it's actually more about these deeper structural ties that are there. Which leads to the, I think, second question, which is why do they care about the Middle East? And you're absolutely right. One of the things that happened in this kind of moment that I was describing about the shift of exports eastward is this was also associated with a rise in the price of oil, partly to do with the increasing global demand. And that incentivized fracking and these kinds of technological changes in shale and US investments in the oil industry domestically, as well as obviously in Canada as part of this, and the kind of ties between Canadian oil and American oil industry. But so the point is that the US doesn't depend upon Middle East oil. Okay? This idea that they want to steal the oil from the region is not true. Or they want to directly own the oil in the region. It's not true. What actually is the bigger picture is about that kind of connection with China, in the sense that if there was a conflict, a deeper conflict, the question of China's energy supplies is going to be a really, really important factor in where that conflict goes. The ability of the United States to put sanctions on Chinese firms will depend upon this story. Okay, what happens with the Gulf and the export of oil to China and elsewhere, as well as, and again, I don't want people to forget the other side to this is the question of financial surpluses. Where does this money actually go? What place does it play in allowing the United States to run these current account deficits? The position of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, which is all bound up with how these financial flows move globally. So there's two sides to this, I think, that make the region ever more important to the kind of future of American power in this context. And then the question of Israel. Yeah, and thanks for this question, because it allows me to say something which is, I think, very important, in the sense that what is distinctive about Israel is the fact that it's a settler colony. The fact that it is a society that was based upon the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population who became refugees in 1948 and also in 1967. The fact that a settler colony is highly racialized, highly militarized. There is a large segment of the population living there that benefits from these kinds of this kind of fact that it's a settler colony and is dependent upon an external power like the United States. And this is not unique to Israel. It's also the case, it was the case in South African apartheid as well. We look at the role that South African apartheid played in the African continent to Britain and the United States. It's a similar kind of functionality, if you like. So if you look at the region, the US has very strong alliances with Egypt, Jordan, with Morocco, these other Arab states. But in all those other Arab states, there is this question of they have to somehow respond. There's repression, they're dictatorial, but they have to respond to the populations to some degree, which is different in the case of Israel. So this is why, if you look throughout the diplomatic history, Alexander Haig, the Secretary of State under Reagan, said, or under Nixon, said that Israel is an American, it's to paraphrase it, something like the biggest American aircraft carrier in the world. It can't be sunk, and yet there are no American soldiers there. Joe Biden said in 1986, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create it. It's the best $3 billion investment we can make in terms of the money they were spending on aid at that point. So you can see this kind of ways in which the internal character of the Israeli state plays into its connection with American power more globally. So that's, I think, the kind of short answer to this, if you like.
Okay. Available to share and to continue the discussion. It always feels a little mean when there's lots of questions to cut it off, so please stay and continue the discussion, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much, everyone.